Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, captivated millions with his voice and charm. But behind the fame, his love story with Priscilla Presley was filled with heartbreak, secrets, and the kind of emotional pain that even the king couldn't escape. What happens when fame meets the fragility of love? In the golden era of rock and roll, Elvis Presley stood as an icon whose influence spanned the globe. His voice was a melody that spoke to the hearts of millions, his movements mesmerizing. But the man behind the microphone and spotlight wasn't the confident king of rock we saw on stage. Behind closed doors, Elvis was a man shaped by loneliness, insecurity, and a deep longing for true love. The world knows Elvis for his music, his stardom, and his untimely demise at a young age. But there was another part of Elvis Presley that only a few knew: his turbulent love affair with Priscilla Presley. They were the epitome of the American dream, but their relationship was anything but a fairy tale. It was marked by challenges, misunderstandings, and secrets that would eventually lead to heartbreak. It all began in 1959 when Elvis, stationed in Germany with the army, met a 14-year-old Priscilla. She was captivated by the legend, and he by her youth and innocence. Their love story ignited in secrecy, a forbidden romance that transcended the norm of any Hollywood relationship. But what truly went on between them behind the scenes? Was their love the grand love story the world saw, or was it a complex journey of unspoken pain, miscommunication, and sacrifices? But the story behind their love is far from the perfect fairy tale the world believed. It's filled with secrets, struggles, and a heartbreak that transcends the glittering lights of Hollywood. Elvis Presley was no ordinary man. Born in 1935 in the small town of Tupelo, Mississippi, Elvis was thrust into the limelight at an age when most people are still finding themselves. He didn't ask for fame. It sought him out, bringing with it the weight of constant expectation, pressure, and loneliness. While he had legions of fans who adored him, no one really knew him. His persona was meticulously crafted, but inside, Elvis struggled with a deep void that fame couldn't fill. The overwhelming spotlight, the incessant demands of his career, and the personal insecurities that followed him from his humble beginnings were often at odds with the charismatic man who danced across stages. Elvis needed something real, something genuine. But could he find it in a world full of distractions and facades? Then came Priscilla. She was only 14 when she first met Elvis. Despite their age difference, Elvis being 10 years her senior, there was an undeniable spark between them. They met in 1959, while Elvis was stationed in Germany with the U.S. Army. Priscilla, whose father was stationed in the same military base, caught Elvis's eye. For a young girl like Priscilla, meeting the king of rock was nothing short of surreal. But for Elvis, it was the beginning of a love story that would become one of the most iconic and yet tragic in pop culture history. Priscilla Presley was raised in a military family, moving from one base to another, never staying in one place for too long. When she first met Elvis, she was living in Wiesbaden, Germany. At just 14 years old, Priscilla was innocent, sheltered, and unaware of the world that awaited her once she entered Elvis's orbit. She was captivated by the man behind the legend, the man who wasn't just the king of rock and roll, but someone who seemed vulnerable and in need of love. Their relationship began slowly. Elvis, who had been in various relationships, was intrigued by Priscilla's youth, beauty, and naivety. They corresponded through letters and phone calls, and during their time apart, their bond grew stronger. Elvis's need for connection and genuine affection led him to Priscilla, and in turn, she became enamored by the man she thought she knew. While Elvis's rise to fame came with its perks, money, adoration, luxury, it also came with an overwhelming sense of isolation. It was hard for him to trust anyone. Everyone around him had an agenda. Love, to him, wasn't just about romance. It was about finding something real, something untarnished by the pressures of stardom. For Priscilla, being in love with Elvis was equally daunting. Though she admired him deeply, being with someone as famous as Elvis meant sacrifices, her own youth, her own identity. She was thrust into a life filled with luxury, but also scrutiny. At just 17, Priscilla moved to Memphis to be with Elvis, leaving behind her family, her friends, and the life she once knew. She became a part of his world, yet she was still a child in many ways, adjusting to a life that was far removed from anything she had imagined. Elvis, on the other hand, was dealing with his own struggles. The intensity of his fame was beginning to take its toll on him. The public's expectations, the constant media attention, the pressure of always being on, it was all consuming. Even in the midst of his rising stardom, he was a man searching for something real to hold on to. Yet, his need for control and his overwhelming fear of vulnerability made it difficult for him to fully embrace the relationship with Priscilla. He would build walls, retreating into his solitude whenever the emotional stakes became too high. Their relationship reached a pivotal moment when Priscilla moved into Elvis's Graceland mansion in 1963. This was when things started to change. Elvis's fame was at its peak, and Priscilla was still young, eager to please, and committed to her relationship with Elvis. But the cracks in their perfect picture began to show. Despite their love for each other, there were whispers of Elvis's growing infidelities, and the toll of fame began to weigh heavily on both of them. In 1966, Elvis proposed to Priscilla, and they married just a year later, in May 1967, with the world watching. It seemed like a fairy tale, but even then, the challenges of their private lives were far from over. The pressure to maintain their love in the face of Elvis's fame, his emotional struggles, and Priscilla's own doubts started to strain their bond. Their marriage would not be the escape from the world they had hoped for, but rather the beginning of their emotional unraveling. As their love story unfolded, it became clear that fame could not protect them from the complexities of human emotions. Elvis, the king of rock, was a man vulnerable to loneliness, insecurity, and the need for deep connection. Priscilla, young and impressionable, found herself trapped in a relationship where love was both a blessing and a curse. Despite their passion for one another, the weight of fame, public scrutiny, and emotional distance began to take its toll. Their story was no longer just about the glitz and glamour of Hollywood. It was about real people struggling to navigate love in a world that demanded so much of them. The real question became, could their love survive the challenges they faced, or would the pressures of fame tear them apart? As Elvis and Priscilla's marriage continued, so did the mounting pressures of their high-profile lives. Elvis, despite his public persona as the king, was privately battling emotional and psychological turmoil. The weight of his fame was unbearable. He often felt trapped, pulled in 100 different directions by fans, the press, and his own insecurities. His emotional needs, complicated by a constant sense of vulnerability, created cracks in his relationship with Priscilla. Elvis's fame was both a blessing and a curse. At the height of his career, the pressure to remain a perfect, unshakable idol consumed him. But the man who could electrify an entire stadium with a single performance couldn't find solace in the quiet of his own home. His insecurities, amplified by his addiction to prescription drugs, made him distant, unpredictable, and often cold. Priscilla, for all her youth and beauty, was left to carry the weight of a marriage that had been built on a foundation of secrecy and public expectations. Her struggle was emotional. She sacrificed her own identity to be the perfect wife to the king, but the relationship became a lonely place. Even with Elvis by her side, the tension between them deepened. Elvis's infidelities were no longer rumors. They were painful truths she couldn't ignore. The once blissful moments of their early days now seemed like distant memories, overshadowed by the reality of their separate lives within the same mansion. While Elvis was caught up in his battles with fame and addiction, Priscilla was left to question everything. She was in a marriage that, from the outside, seemed perfect, but in reality, it was deteriorating under the weight of emotional neglect. Priscilla's struggle was more than just external. On the surface, she was married to the most famous man in the world. She had everything a woman could want: money, luxury, a beautiful home. But what Priscilla didn't have was true happiness. She felt increasingly isolated in a relationship that was one-sided. She was young, still trying to find her place in the world, and yet she was expected to be the supportive wife of a man who had everything except the one thing he needed most: true connection. The loneliness that crept into their marriage began to take its toll on Priscilla. As Elvis sank further into his addiction, becoming more distant and withdrawn, Priscilla found herself questioning whether the life she had given up for him was worth the sacrifices. She began to question her own identity, torn between the role of the devoted wife and the woman who longed for freedom, self-discovery, and genuine emotional intimacy. The emotional strain on their marriage continued to grow. As Elvis's career began to slow, so did his drive and motivation. The energetic, electrifying man who once set the stage on fire now struggled with the simplest of tasks. The addiction to pills, the depression, the loneliness, they all took their toll. Elvis was no longer the man Priscilla had fallen in love with. In contrast, Priscilla found herself changing. She became stronger, more independent. She enrolled in a private school to finish her education, something she had never had the chance to do before. As her own sense of self began to form, so did the realization that she was no longer willing to live in the shadow of Elvis's fame. She was growing up, and the woman she was becoming needed more than the role of wife to a troubled star. The emotional gap between them was widening, and neither knew how to bridge it. The love they had for each other was still there, but it had become clouded by addiction, insecurity, and the overwhelming pressures of their public lives. Their separations, though brief, were becoming more frequent. The cracks that had formed in their relationship couldn't be ignored. Priscilla, who had once been so devoted to Elvis, began to feel like an outsider in her own marriage. Her emotional needs, her need for communication, her desire for intimacy were ignored in favor of Elvis's never-ending quest for validation and escape from his inner demons. Elvis, too, felt the distance between them. He knew he was losing Priscilla, but he couldn't bring himself to change. The fame that had once built him up now kept him isolated. Every moment of happiness he shared with her seemed fleeting, overshadowed by the internal chaos he struggled with daily. He could no longer connect with her in the way he once had, and the guilt he carried only deepened the divide. A pivotal moment came when Priscilla found herself alone in the vast corridors of Graceland, contemplating a future where Elvis was no longer a part of her life. It wasn't just the infidelities that hurt her, it was the emotional distance, the lack of communication, the loss of the man she had fallen in love with. The pressures of fame had suffocated their love, and Priscilla began to realize that no amount of affection could save them from the emotional destruction that had taken root in their marriage. The tensions in Elvis and Priscilla's marriage were no longer subtle. They had reached a breaking point where the emotional disconnect was too powerful to ignore. Elvis's addiction, his fame, and his emotional struggles were pushing them further apart, while Priscilla's own emotional needs and personal growth led her to a realization that perhaps it was time to let go. Their love, once full of promise and passion, was being suffocated by the very things that made them famous. The stakes were rising. Their love was hanging by a thread, and neither Elvis nor Priscilla knew how to salvage it. The pressures of fame, the inner battles they fought, and the emotional toll on both of them created a perfect storm. Would they survive the storm, or would the destructive forces of fame and insecurity finally tear them apart? The inevitable unraveling of Elvis and Priscilla's relationship reached its peak in 1973 when their divorce was finalized. The emotional and public fallout was swift and devastating for both. What had once seemed like a fairy tale love story was now an open wound for the world to witness. For Elvis, the divorce was a blow he never fully recovered from. Despite his fame, his wealth, and the adoration of millions, Elvis was human. He had vulnerabilities that no amount of money or fame could shield him from. Priscilla was not just his wife. She was the woman who had stood by him through his darkest moments, the one person who had known him intimately. And now, she was gone. Elvis had a hard time letting go. His devastated reaction to the divorce was well documented. He was heartbroken, struggling with feelings of abandonment. His addiction issues, already a heavy burden on his mental and physical health, only deepened in the aftermath of their separation. He spiraled further into his isolation, pushing away the few people who cared about him. His personal life, which had always been volatile, was now at an all-time low. The man who once commanded the world with his voice now couldn't even find peace within himself. For Priscilla, the decision to leave Elvis was equally painful, but in a different way. She was emotionally exhausted, and despite her deep love for him, she could no longer stay in a relationship that had become toxic. She had tried to save their marriage, but the walls were too high. She had sacrificed so much for Elvis, including her own identity, but in the end, she had to let go. The pain of staying in a broken marriage, where she was constantly caught between love and resentment, was too much to bear. Priscilla found herself at a crossroads. Her life, once dictated by Elvis's career and public persona, was now her own. But even as she walked away from the relationship, the emotional scars of their years together remained. She had lost more than just a husband. She had lost the dream of a perfect love. In many ways, Priscilla was also grieving the loss of who she had been when she was with Elvis. She was now a woman without a crown, without a stage, and without the king of rock by her side. The emotional toll of the divorce didn't just affect Elvis and Priscilla, it affected everyone around them. The world had watched their love story unfold, and now the world had to watch it fall apart. The press was relentless, dissecting every detail of their separation, questioning their every move, and fueling the public's fascination with their personal lives. Elvis, whose life had already been marked by public scrutiny, now faced even more judgment and condemnation. He was no longer just the king of rock and roll, he was a man who had lost the most important person in his life. For Priscilla, the divorce became a public spectacle as well. She was no longer just the wife of Elvis Presley. She was now a woman trying to rebuild her life. She had to navigate the media's constant interest in her, trying to maintain some semblance of privacy in a world that demanded answers. But through it all, Priscilla remained resilient. She focused on her daughter, Lisa Marie Presley, and found a new sense of purpose outside of Elvis's shadow. In many ways, the divorce marked the beginning of Priscilla's journey towards self-discovery, a path she had long put on hold for the sake of her marriage. But despite their personal losses, both Elvis and Priscilla continued to feel the weight of their past. Elvis, though still loved by his fans, was a man unraveling. His emotional and physical decline became more evident with each passing day. The pain of losing Priscilla, combined with his ongoing struggles with addiction, led him down a path of self-destruction. For Priscilla, the memories of their time together remained. She would never forget the man she had once loved, the man who had given her everything and nothing at the same time. But she also knew that their time together had come to an end. She had to honor the man Elvis was, but also accept that the relationship they once had could never be salvaged. Elvis and Priscilla's divorce was more than just a personal loss. It was the tragic result of their private lives being continuously exposed to the world. Their relationship had always been under the microscope, and as their marriage deteriorated, the public's fascination only intensified. The media's constant intrusion into their personal lives made it even harder for them to heal. Elvis, who had spent so many years keeping his struggles hidden behind a smile and a charming persona, could no longer escape the emotional turmoil that consumed him. The divorce was a public acknowledgement of his failures he had already felt in his heart long before the papers were signed. Priscilla, too, was forced to confront her own emotional baggage in the glaring spotlight of fame. The woman who had once stood by Elvis's side as the perfect wife was now labeled the ex-wife of a rock legend, her every move scrutinized by the public. The divorce marked a turning point in Elvis and Priscilla's lives, a public and private breakdown that shattered their love and forever altered their paths. Elvis's heartbreak and Priscilla's decision to walk away were filled with emotional intensity, as both were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. But even in the midst of their pain, they would go on to have a profound impact on each other's lives. For Elvis, the separation was the final blow to a life that had already been in decline. The king had lost his queen, and with her, he lost a piece of himself. For Priscilla, the decision to leave was one of the hardest she would ever make, but it was also the first step toward finding herself outside of Elvis's shadow. The emotional wounds from their divorce would linger, but life went on for both of them. Their love story had ended in tragedy, but it was far from forgotten. The legacy of their love and their loss would continue to resonate for years to come. After the divorce, both Elvis and Priscilla faced lives vastly different from the one they had once shared. For Elvis, the fallout from his separation with Priscilla was more than just emotional, it was physical. The king of rock and roll, who once commanded the world with his music and charm, had now descended into a shadow of his former self. His struggles with addiction worsened, and his health began to decline. Elvis, who had always been a man of intense highs and crushing lows, now faced an unbearable sadness. The loss of Priscilla, the woman he had loved deeply, became one of the most significant emotional blows of his life. Elvis's decline was evident to those around him. He became reclusive, retreating into the confines of Graceland, a place that once felt like a sanctuary, but now felt like a prison. His performances, which had once been the epitome of energy and passion, began to feel strained. Elvis was still performing, still touring, but the joy had faded from his music. The loss of Priscilla seemed to have taken away the very essence of who he was. His struggle to regain his footing was compounded by the constant media scrutiny, which only deepened his isolation. But Elvis's downfall was not just due to the emotional toll of his divorce, it was a culmination of years of neglecting his own health, both physically and mentally. The king had once been larger than life, but now the world watched as his image crumbled under the weight of addiction, depression, and grief. His personal life, which had been so public, was now spiraling out of control. The man who had once ruled the world was now just a man, alone and broken. While Elvis was spiraling, Priscilla was emerging from the wreckage of their marriage as a stronger, more self-assured woman. After their divorce, Priscilla began to rebuild her life, focusing on her daughter, Lisa Marie Presley, and creating a future outside of Elvis's shadow. For years, Priscilla had been defined by her relationship with Elvis. Now, she had the opportunity to redefine herself. She enrolled in acting classes, and soon after, her career began to take off. Priscilla would go on to achieve success in her own right, particularly through her work in the television series Dallas, and later, her involvement in the Elvis Presley estate, where she worked tirelessly to preserve Elvis's legacy. Though Priscilla would go on to marry again, she would always carry the memories of her life with Elvis, both the good and the bad. But through it all, she found the strength to keep moving forward, carving out a space for herself in the world, independent of the man who had once been the center of her life. She came to terms with the fact that their love, no matter how intense, couldn't withstand the pressures they faced. Priscilla remained respectful of their past, never allowing the bitterness of their divorce to define her future. She had loved Elvis with all her heart, but she had learned that love alone could not save them. Even after their divorce, Elvis and Priscilla remained a part of each other's lives, primarily through their daughter, Lisa Marie. They both played active roles in raising Lisa Marie, co-parenting in a way that showed respect for their shared past. Though their romantic love had ended, they maintained a friendship, a bond that was tempered by mutual respect and the bittersweet memories of their shared history. Their post-divorce relationship was one of acknowledgement and acceptance. They both understood that their love had run its course, but that didn't mean they couldn't share moments of companionship in their later years. They still talked, shared moments of joy and sorrow, and maintained a connection that, though no longer romantic, was rooted in the deep history they shared. But despite their efforts to remain friends, the scars of their divorce were undeniable. The emotional baggage they carried from their marriage continued to linger. Elvis, despite his efforts to move forward, never truly recovered from the loss of Priscilla. The woman he had once loved was gone, and with her he had lost a piece of himself. For Priscilla, the relationship was always bittersweet. She had loved Elvis with all her heart, and while she had moved on, the memories of their time together would never fade. They had experienced something extraordinary, but also something painful, a love story that had been shaped by their individual needs, insecurities, and ultimately, their inability to truly connect on a deeper level. Elvis and Priscilla's love story is one that continues to captivate the world to this day. It is a tale of passion, heartbreak, and the harsh reality that fame cannot shield us from the most human of emotions. Their relationship, both the highs and the lows, has become a part of pop culture, an emblematic example of the complexities of love in the public eye. Their love story is remembered not just for the glittering moments of happiness, but also for the tragic breakdown that followed. It serves as a reminder that even the most iconic couples are not immune to the pressures of fame, addiction, and personal struggles. Their relationship was a microcosm of the struggle between the personal and the public, love and loss, happiness and heartbreak. Though their love story didn't have the happy ending the world had hoped for, it remains one of the most talked about and poignant chapters in the history of rock and roll. Elvis and Priscilla's legacy continues to inspire and resonate with millions of people around the world who see their own struggles reflected in their story. Elvis and Priscilla's journey, from passionate love to heartbreaking separation, is a tale of contrasts. They were both victims of the intense pressures that come with fame, but they were also survivors. Their love story, filled with highs and lows, ultimately became one of the most enduring in pop culture history. Elvis's decline after their divorce and Priscilla's growth after their separation are testament to their resilience. Their love may have ended, but its impact is still felt, not just in the world of music, but in the very human experience of love, loss, and redemption. Elvis and Priscilla Presley's love story is more than just a tale of fame and heartbreak. It's a reminder that no matter how much success we achieve, we are all human, and our deepest emotional struggles are universal. Their love story was one of passion and longing, but also one of pain and sacrifice. Despite the world watching their every move, despite the glitter and glamour of their public lives, they were still two people trying to find their way through a relationship marred by fame, addiction, and the impossible expectations that come with being icons. Elvis, the king, had everything the world could offer: fame, wealth, and adoration. But in the end, it wasn't enough. The love he shared with Priscilla, despite its intensity and the dreams they once had together, couldn't withstand the pressures that fame placed on their lives. Priscilla, too, found herself caught between love and loss, trying to navigate a world she wasn't entirely prepared for. And yet, through the pain, both found strength. Their story isn't just about two famous figures. It's about the human heart, its fragility, and its resilience. It's about how even the most public figures are not immune to the private battles that shape their lives. Their love was imperfect, but it was real. It wasn't a fairy tale, but it was a journey of self-discovery, personal growth, and ultimately, acceptance. In many ways, their love story is a reflection of our own, of the relationships we cherish, the mistakes we make, and the lessons we learn. We may not be in the spotlight like Elvis and Priscilla, but we all face the challenges of love, loss, and finding our true selves. So, what do you think? Could Elvis and Priscilla have made it through if they weren't in the public eye? How do you think fame affects real relationships? Would they have been able to navigate their personal struggles if they weren't constantly under the media's microscope? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and share your perspective on their love story. If you found this journey through their ups and downs impactful, don't forget to like and share this video with others who may also be touched by their story. Remember to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that explore love, fame, and the complexities of human relationships. Elvis and Priscilla's legacy lives on, not just in the music and memories of the king of rock and roll, but in the emotional lessons we can all take from their journey. Their story shows us that even in the midst of heartbreak, there is growth. Even in loss, there is love. Their story is far from over. It continues to shape our understanding of love, fame, and the human condition. For as long as their music plays, as long as their story is told, Elvis and Priscilla will remain icons forever intertwined in the hearts of those who believe in the power of love, even when it fades away.